Hi everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live. As you can probably see behind me, coming from a hotel room, so let's keep our fingers crossed that everything works as we go through today's conversation. But I do want to thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't been to an AOP Live before, it's really all about the questions that you submitted in advance, and also questions that Kelly and I will put to today's guests in our conversation. I do invite you to ask a question as we go through the conversation. You can do that just as a box underneath this video. Pop any questions in there, and Kelly and I will be keeping an eye on things. But Kelly, first of all, thanks for joining me as well today, and welcome to the AOP Live.
Absolutely. Looking forward to a good discussion today.
Yeah, so we're going to be tag teaming today, asking the questions around today's topic. So we're talking about flexing procurement's problem-solving superpowers. So we all put so much effort in on a day-to-day basis within procurement, but pretty highly fragmented. Actually, I did a podcast on this a couple of weeks ago about how we put a lot of effort into a lot of things, whether that's supplier rationalization efforts, diversification, risk management, savings, ESG targets, you name it. There's lots and lots for us to work in procurement. And as a result, we really have, and this is something we're passionate about at procurement, is running this procurement team like an entrepreneurial business within a business. And to do that, we need some really top-notch, excellent problem-solving skills. We're going to be talking a little bit about that today and how we can put those into practice. So our guests, if you are a regular listener to the Art of Procurement podcast or watcher of our AOP Lives, will need no introduction. We're going to be joined by Joe Payne. Joe is the SVP of Source to Pay at Corcentric, and also Jennifer Ulrich. Jennifer is the Vice President of Advisory, also at Corcentric. So with that all said, let's get into our conversation. And first of all, hey Joe, hey Jennifer, thank you very much for joining us again on one of our AOP Lives.
Hello.
Thank you for having us.
So I've asked you the typical standard question many times, and I'm not going to do that today, asking you about your procurement backstory. So let's go and kind of skip that and go into really a question that's related to the topic of the conversation we want to cover today. And Jen, I'm going to ask you this first, put you on the spot. We talked in the intro about problem solving. What's one of the best problem solving techniques that you've learned from your time in procurement?
I think it has to go back to really spending time up front to define the problem correctly. And if you think about, where people often go wrong, it's just jumping right to solutioning so quickly, right? We don't want to spend the time up front to really understand all the aspects of the problem because we're so excited and we're in such a fast-paced environment that we just need to get to the end as quickly as possible. So I think that's where people find the most gaps is not spending time up front planning and really understanding what the root cause is.
Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later as well. So let's we'll dig into the details. But Joe, anything that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think Jen kind of hit it spot on. That requirement definition is so important, and then I would add like restating the problem and rethinking the problem as you go, because sometimes as more information becomes available, you realize the thing you set out to fix is not the real problem.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to be able to change and adapt. So honestly, the thing that came to mind when you asked the question to me was adaptability. It's not necessarily a problem solving technique, but something that if you are really trying to solve problems or fix issues, you have to have that ability to adapt, and in procurement, we've talked about this before, but just think about the types of problems procurement has to solve and the things they're set with dealing with every day. You have to analyze data. You have to know how to do sourcing and be a sourcing expert, a supplier, relationship manager, change manager, self-promoter in some ways. You have to, people always think of procurement as the negotiator. You have to be really strong at negotiating. And these are all things like you're going to face problems in all these different areas. And so that adaptability and ability to not just use, a hammer on a nail, but to like look at different ways to get the nail into the board is really important.
It's interesting you say that, because what it brought to mind is, we talk about generalists versus specialists in procurement, and the vast majority of us in procurement are generalists. And I wonder if, because of some of the things that you talked about, that's what it lends itself to us having knowledge about lots of things without necessarily being specialist in one. Do you think that's probably perhaps one of the reasons why there's so many of us that are generalists in procurement?
Yeah, I mean, I can't discount the need for subject matter expertise and really strong subject matter expertise in particular categories. And I think every procurement person should have kind of their niche of where they really know a market really well, or a set of markets really well. But they also have to be generalists, right? You can't just be the one that knows, a metals market really well, but then you can't handle something that's not metals. And we have to have that ability to take on different types of work and to solve different types of problems. And so a good combination of generalist, I would say, acumen with some level of niche tied to that is, I think, where the best procurement people fit.
Now, Jen, you speak and work with a lot of procurement teams every day. And so I'm really interested in what kind of stress level or fatigue you're seeing in procurement. Are you seeing something that's it's typical, it's what, we all put up with every day, or are you seeing that there's more pressure and more stress on teams now than ever before?
Right now, yes. We're getting back into savings goals, a lot more pressure from the business to cut costs while going through digital transformations with headcount shortage. I think we're in one of the toughest times ever for procurement, to have to be everywhere and everything all at once. And just be that right expert within the business, and be tech savvy and cut costs, and not talk about cutting costs with our business stakeholders, but be mindful of our savings goals. Ultimately, I think they have a lot going on. That's what we've seen across the board. Still struggling with the same challenges they faced with traditionally, which is trying to get the business to recognize the value they offer and bring them in at the right time, but also getting a lot of pressure from the other side. So it's definitely a really interesting time out there right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Something that we heard was, from many CPOs really, is how, because a lot of in companies where cost savings are, the main value metric, if you will, going through the last 12, 18 months of inflation, it's kind of this, like, what am I here for if I can't save money? And so there's been a lot of coaching that's been needing to be done from CPOs with their teams, that their value isn't all wrapped up in how much money they save, because that's what we've really been through. Right. And that's difficult from a mental perspective, from a procurement professional who's used to valuing themselves with just how much money they save at the end of the year.
Agreed.
So we, in advance of today's session, we did a mini poll within LinkedIn, which we're just going to bring up on screen, because I'd love to get your perspective on the answers that we received. Now, I'm going to read this out for anybody who's not watching and is listening to this later. So the question was, what is the most entrepreneurial skill procurement needs to possess? And as always with these polls on LinkedIn, we have 4 answers we can give you. So we gave, the answers that we got were, in first place, time or project management at 39%, customer service second at 24%, acting on feedback third in 21%, and then sales and marketing skills were fourth with 17%. Joe, I'm going to come to you first and just ask for your perspective on these results.
Well, it's interesting. Your last question was, is there still a high stress level in procurement? And, based on the number one answer there, it kind of confirms that yes, there is a high stress level, right? If you've got way too many projects, way too many meetings, way too many competing priorities, or everything's urgent, right? And hot in terms of urgency, then time and project management is naturally going to be top of mind in terms of what you need to be successful in your role. But I would consider that to be more of a reactive consideration than a proactive one, right? So it's not a surprise to me what I see in these results, and why that time management is number one here. But if you think about what's really important and what's going, as Jen was talking about, the value or perception of procurement, what's going to improve that, it's not time management, right?
Yeah.
Time management is table stakes. You need to have that in really any profession. It doesn't have to be just procurement. In any corporate setting, if you don't have good time management and good project management skills, it's going to be hard to be successful in your role. But if you look at the last two, acting on feedback and sales and marketing, those two really tie to that value or perception of procurement. How is procurement perceived by their internal customers, right? If you're acting on feedback, if you're a good promoter of the function and telling the success stories and why it's going to help the different functions that you support, it's ultimately going to make your job easier. And it's going to allow you to be more proactive, where you're getting involved earlier in the conversation, when you're, not just getting thrown a contract at the end, which we're going to talk about a little bit, but like getting a contract thrown at you at the end of a internal stakeholder review and say, can you do any better than 10% discount on this? That's not where procurement wants to be. And so those two bottom ones, I mean, if you add them up, it's 38%, right? It doesn't even equal the time management. But to me, they're much more important in terms of that value or perception of procurement.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I look at, I think my vote was probably with sales and marketing. And then somebody could look and say, well, we talked about how stressed we are. We've got so much work to do. Why do I need sales and marketing skills? Because I've already got too much to do. But it's really all about what you're doing as opposed to how much work you're doing. And so that's probably one of the reasons why sales and marketing skills will get not prioritized, because people are thinking, well, I'm already, I can't take on more work. Why do I need to go and try and harvest more work in? Kelly, I actually want to come to you and ask if you had any thoughts on seeing this.
I do, and it's so funny. I love an opportunity to streamline and be more efficient. If anybody wants to talk about time management and task prioritization and all that, that's one of my favorite things. The interesting thing to me is the difference between the time and project management and the customer service. I have a feeling that a lot of the tasks that are sitting in that 39% around time and project management don't have nearly as much value to our customers or the business overall as we would realize if we'd stop to think about them purposely. I have a feeling there's things we're doing sort of rote out of habit that don't hold a lot of value, and it's creating time pressure for us. Whereas if we were prioritizing our time and effort based on what the business is telling us they want and need, yes, absolutely, we're going to get new tasks that we're not doing now. But some of those old things that we've done forever, the way we've always done things, I have a feeling some of those would fall away, and it would be overall sort of a positive balance. So interesting that those two are so different from a vote perspective.
Jen, is there anything that's missing that we should have added on there?
Yeah, I think when I first saw the four options, I kind of, a couple ideas came to mind, but then as I thought more about it, they're all kind of embedded in these. So it's relationship management, right? And that works into sales and marketing, customer service, acting on feedback. But then also, if I were going to answer this question sort of with a open-ended, I'd say creativity is probably the most important skill that procurement needs to have from an entrepreneurial standpoint, right? It's being able to problem solve with a very creative mindset and ultimately know that the same problem might not have the same solution twice, right? Each time is going to have different components and variants to it, right? But I still think all of these things are really important, but you have to really look behind what's in these, like what you said, Phil, around sales and marketing. That's relationship development and delegation. And it may feel like you're essentially asking for more work, but you want the right work, not more work, right? So that takes skill, I think, in being able to differentiate between those things.
Yeah, it's interesting you said about creativity, and Joe said earlier about adaptability. For a function that was brought up on being very process driven, those can be pretty difficult skill sets because we're kind of programmed that these are the 5 steps or the 7 steps or the 9 steps that we have to kind of rigidly follow, and how much procurement is changing that we need that framework, but we need to be, as you both said, adaptable and creative around those based on what the customer needs. Well, stakeholder, what the stakeholder needs. And one of those things in sales and marketing is discovery, that I think is a really important skill, which is going to come in actually as we segue into our first section, because the first kind of topic that I want to talk about is how do we understand the problems that exist that we're looking to solve for? And so, Jen, you talk a lot about diagnosis before prescription. So identifying and understanding the problems, doing that discovery work before figuring out what the solution is. And you mentioned that right at the top of today's AOP Live. Do you find that that's a step that teams often skip?
Either they skip it or they go through it way too quickly without considering all of the possible components to the problem, right? When you're under a lot of pressure to get to the solution, to close the contract, to get a supplier in, whatever the case is, you're not necessarily opening up the conversation to all the possibilities of what might be the actual root cause of the problem, right? I think what often happens as well is that you're not talking to all the right people. We get so narrowly focused on this very specific thing. We see it all the time when we're looking at technology, right? I might be implementing an AP solution, but I have to remind people that we have to talk to procurement too. And it's why we're AP, right? How oftentimes you see things kind of fall from upstream to downstream because you just haven't thought through all of those components. Yeah. So I think it's really important for procurement to be consultative in their approach when they're doing that root cause analysis, like you were saying before, about not necessarily being an expert in everything and being a generalist. Really what it comes down to is knowing the right questions to ask, I think.
So that's a great, and I know it's an open-ended question, but what kind of questions do you ask when you're going through that discovery process, when you're trying to understand the root cause of an issue?
I think what it comes down to is just, understanding what are you trying to achieve here? How are you measuring success? Do you, if you say that you're trying to solve this problem with this solution, now work backwards from that. How do you actually see that solving your problem? Have you thought about these other things? Like if you're putting in place a new technology or a service, have you thought about training? Does everybody have the right level of training to be able to leverage that technology solution? Have you thought about who else this impacts? Because, how often does that happen where we're making decisions in a bit of a silo and we haven't factored in all the right people that have to be involved? Even if they have a very small role, they're still a decision maker and can really hold things up at the end. And then just asking those broad questions of have you thought about the everything, right? Have you thought about all the different components to this particular contract or supplier? And sometimes just by asking general questions, it gets them thinking, and then you can kind of pull through that and create the conversation. And like I said, I think it's a very consultative approach that procurement can take, but you don't have to be an expert. You can ask the same set of questions and get very different answers every time.
Yeah, I might add to that too, like asking who should be involved in this project, right? That often, to Jen's point, kind of gets the wheels turning of, oh yeah, we thought this was an AP project, but when you think about it, it connects to procurement and it connects to finance here. We probably need stakeholders from different groups to have some input into what we're doing. Maybe even engage IT, these types of things where at the beginning of a project, to your point, Phil, what is the role that procurement's trying to play? Are we compliance officers and in some cases order takers, or are we business enablers, right? If we're business enablers, then we're going to say we need, if it's a software project, for example, we need IT input now, not once we go to award the supplier, right? Why? Well, they're going to bring in some technical requirements and they probably have a checklist we need to fill out. And there's some governance tied to this. Stakeholders, if they haven't bought software before, they might not know that, right? They might not even be on their top of mind in any way. So if you're guiding them, you're becoming a business enabler, you're clearing roadblocks early in the project versus when you're so far down the road. It just saves everybody a lot of time, but it also gives that perception of, okay, these are not order takers. These are folks that are going to facilitate and actually help me get my project done.
And if I can just jump in quickly, Phil, something really important I feel like I heard Jennifer and Joe sort of say corresponding pieces of We started this by talking about the level of stress and pressure that procurement is feeling. But when we think about the business trying to jump to the solution, it's not because they're being pushy or bossy. It's because they're feeling the exact same stress that we are. It's just a slightly different shape and flavor. And so, sort of like an empathy check-in, if procurement is looking to get to the point where we're not being order takers, right, Joe, and we're actually being part of the solution, whether it's us saying, listen, we are all stressed out, or I hear the pressure that you're under, help me understand the situation you're dealing with. That's sort of a prime entrepreneurial moment where someone comes to you in trust and you get to be an active part of solving it. Might feel safer to stay in the tactical realm, might feel more familiar. Our frameworks are certainly more geared to that. But I think that connecting and understanding that everybody is under the same pressure we are right now, that's sort of a huge positioning opportunity for procurement teams.
Yeah, just real quick too, I want to again play off of that too, that we talk about these concepts sometimes in these conversations, and we're putting ideas out there that we think procurement teams can really leverage immediately. But I want to caveat that keep in mind when you are starting to change your approach with your business stakeholders, don't expect them to jump in and be like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, let's do this, right? You're going to get resistance, you're going to get rejected, but don't let that defeat you, because the entrepreneurial aspect of that is not giving up and doing it again and again, and is creating that repeatability and saying, we need to do this. I understand. Okay, I know you have things to do, but just so you know, we've thought about these things. Next time, let's talk a little sooner, right? And just keep going with it, because I promise you that it will be successful, but they're going to resist right away. So I don't want to put it out there that this idea is just something you can implement tomorrow and suddenly see success. It takes time.
Yeah, that entrepreneurial skill of resilience that I just wrote down.
Yeah.
Keep on going,
Yep.
going. And how many times have we gone through transformations and you talk to stakeholders and they say, well, this is the third time we've heard this, or this is the fourth time we've done this, and nothing changed. So there can be a lot of skepticism to overcome at the beginning. But one of the things I'm interested in, because sometimes I hear pushback of, and this can be from a transformation program, it can be from, when you're looking at bringing together a category for the first time that you haven't looked at before, you get this resistance of, I don't need to go and talk to that person, or we don't really need to talk to that person, or, we don't want to open it up too wide because they're not going to give us good feedback, or whatever it may be. There's often a pushback to only include those conversations with a very small circle. How do you look at that, Jen? Do you how far is too far when we're looking at doing this discovery and bringing as many people as possible into the conversation?
What I would say, this is a question I'll often ask when I get resistance in this area, is unfortunately have to kind of tap into the pain aspect of, okay, you don't want to do it this way, that's fine, but has this ever failed in the past when you didn't follow this path, right? And I guarantee every single time they're going to come up with at least one solid example of, wait, I rushed too quickly into this solution and it failed miserably. Oh, okay. You have to kind of really make it personal for an individual so that they can connect the dots themselves without you having to be the one to say, trust me, it's not going to work. They need to believe it for themselves and come to that conclusion. So that's something I'll always kind of bring in, and it works a lot. Not every time, but that's the piece to say, have you ever forgotten to include a stakeholder before and what happened? Or have you forgotten IT, and how much longer did it take you to get through this implementation? Or if you didn't give legal a heads up, how long did it take? Just kind of, again, asking questions that we kind of know the answers to, but they have to get there themselves,
Yeah, I think there's an education component too, right? If you treat it like an education, even if you have some good examples from the past where, oh, well, we skipped that step when we did this project, and here's what happened. Here's what's the end result, right? So if we could use examples to educate, that often helps people kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, we might not want to open this too wide right now, but we might need to engage X, Y, and Z, because at some point we're going to need to bring them in. So better early than late.
Do you think we fear negative feedback, Jen? Is that a reason why we sometimes limit the questions or the people we ask the questions to?
Just like our stakeholders are resistant to change, so are we. Change is hard. Doing things different is scary. It's like you said, I think like Kelly said, kind of sticking with the tactical and the way I've always done it is easy. It's the easy way to go about it. You're still going to get the job done, right? But it's when you really push yourself and embrace the fear that you'll see higher levels of success. But not everybody's built for that. Not everybody wants to really push that limit, right? But yeah, I would say that it is scary, and that's why I say, dip your toe, right? Like, just start small with asking questions here and there, and be very agile with it, right? So think about, I asked this question and it didn't work. Okay, let me try asking it this way next time, and just ease into it over time, because then if you're doing it more slowly with your stakeholders, they're going to embrace it a little bit better too. If you're, instead of just completely trying to flip the switch and do something different tomorrow, it might be a little bit disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joe, one of the things we talked about, as we were preparing for today's conversation, was staying calm in the face of a challenge being a superpower. I wonder if you could just, elaborate that a little bit, and if you've seen any examples where that has proven to be the case.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I remember we did one of these podcasts shortly after COVID started, right? And we were talking about that reactionary kind of approach to, okay, the sky is literally falling here. What are we going to do? Procurement, go out and push out payment terms and cut prices. And what we talked about on that podcast was, that's not the approach we want to take. We need to stay calm. This is a challenge. This is probably the biggest challenge procurement is going to face. If you do those things, you may have that short-term gain of, extending out cash flow or cutting some costs where you need to. But when the suppliers will probably accept it in the short term, when products become scarce or capacity becomes constrained, you're going to go to the bottom of their list. Mm-hmm. And guess what? That's what happened. Yep. Right. So we saw, a year into COVID, all of a sudden there was an extreme, well, it wasn't even a year, right? It was probably 4 or 5 months into COVID. Shortages started coming out. Supply chains were deteriorated. And the folks who were able to get product were the ones who did not go and beat up their suppliers and push out payment terms to 360 days. Mm-hmm. They were the ones that engaged their suppliers, looked for more win-win solutions, stayed calm, didn't take, the board or the C-level sponsor telling you this is what we have to do. They were able to come up with a business case for why that didn't make sense. And those are the ones that thrived. And the others had outages, right? They had to shut down production, or they had to close facilities because they didn't have the proper safety supplies, or what have you. And that's the reality, right? So if we staying calm, we're calling it a superpower here, right? Because it is easier said than done, right? When you're in a very stressful situation, it's not easy to stay calm. But like in the vein of what we're talking about, of like seeing what the impact of decisions are going to be, not just short term, but long term, that's really important. And maybe you don't have to be super calm to do that, right? Just to be able to think it through. But that's part of it, is seeing that long-term picture and then not reacting if that long-term picture seems to have a negative impact. If you react the way you're expected to react, right? So, COVID is thankfully, a lot of the stress of it is in the past. There's still obviously problems with it, but for procurement, that was really, I think, the strongest test I've ever seen of staying calm in the face of a challenge. And you can see clearly the impact it's had on specific organizations if they were reactive. And what I would call reactive is not staying calm, or if they were thinking about that long-term picture and making sure that the importance of supplier relationships was considered while they were making those decisions right when COVID started.
Yeah, and I would add the message that you're sending to your stakeholders as well, in the way you, and the reason I say this, very early in my career, and the guilty will remain nameless, but there was, when we're all working in the same offices as each other, there would be somebody within our team who every time he was on the phone to somebody in a distribution center or maybe in the logistics, in the manufacturing plant, would be shouting down the phone at this person, every day without fail. Like, we got to know the people's name that he was shouting at. And so he got what he needed, every time that he did that. But then you're not positioning yourself internally to be seen as somebody who is level-headed, who can manage in a crisis, who's somebody to go for help when help is needed, because of basically the signals that you're showing internally. So it's not just an external, how do you treat your suppliers? It's, are you positioning yourself as somebody who is seen as, a problem solver internally, or someone that's just going to go and shout at people to try and get stuff done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a similar, like I said, staying calm isn't always easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because you kind of want to react with certain situations. And I could even see personally, where I'm dealing with folks and I'm trying to get them to think about things one way, and the frustration can build up, right? And that's when you turn into that person you were just talking about. But that's you may get what you want short term, but long term, it almost discredits the individual. Right.
So Kelly, I'm going to come to you in a moment. I just have one last question. We had a question that came in from Jeffrey. Jeffrey says, I'm a lone wolf in my organization and looking for specific advice on how a single person can thrive. And so, Jen, I'm going to ask this to you first of all, and Joe, of course, feel free to jump in. The question is, what if you have a small team? How can you handle an unexpected challenge when it might be overwhelming because you don't necessarily have the resources to be able to throw at it?
I think that when you're in that situation, transparency is your best bet. Obviously sometimes people forget that you're the only person in the role, and just remind them that, hey, I'm only one person. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do, right? Being upfront and being honest about how you can help, but also seeing if there's a way to prioritize, right? Like, and understand, again, I don't know the situation, but, where there might be multiple priorities, say, talk to your manager and say, hey, it sounds like this person really needs help. Can I get some additional help to help this person? Or can I reset my priorities so that I can focus on this for a short time? Yeah. But when I imagine you can fall into the trap of taking on too much, just every day, right? Because you want to be that resource, but what you'll do is end up hurting yourself and your credibility in the long run. People will respect you more if you say, no, I really can't help you right now with this, but here are some ideas and tips and resources for how you can do this on your own. That's, I think, when you're in that situation, education, to Joe's point earlier, is your biggest advocate, right? Is having resources available that you can share with people until your team grows, so they don't feel like, oh no, I just can't help you, you're on your own, but you're at least giving them something to go off of and to take and maybe help solve the problem themselves.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that when I think about a small procurement team, I think, well, in many cases, maybe it's also a new procurement team, right? Where maybe it was decentralized, or they didn't have procurement. People just kind of bought what they needed, tied to budgets or whatnot. And then they brought procurement in. And what we see a lot with that is, it's always seen as a good idea. Oh, absolutely, we need procurement. And there's a high expectation for savings and what the value that procurement's going to bring. But companies often have a low expectation or haven't really thought through what it means to individual stakeholders in terms of people who are used to buying their own stuff without someone kind of looking over their shoulder, and the level of engagement that procurement's going to get from a business, right? So, meaning, will the business actually want to utilize the function? Because the same folks that say yes, 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 when the concept is out there of should we create a procurement function, can always be the same ones that say, no, I meant that for everybody else, not me. The easy example is a CFO. And often the procurement, especially early stage procurement, is going to report into a CFO. And you say, boss, I'm having trouble. I can't get folks to engage. Can we look at the auditor maybe first, or these consultants? No, those are too important, right? Those areas we don't need to look at. Let's look at, office supplies. And so that, education, yes, but it's also, I'd say, twofold. One is communication. because you're brought in, you're a small team, maybe you're one, and you can't expect everyone in the company to understand why you're there, right?
Yeah.
They don't know unless you tell them.
Yeah.
It's hard to think that through, right? Wait, they decided that they chose to create a procurement function. I must be needed. Everyone must understand why I'm here. No one understands. They're busy doing their job. You need to tell them. And then create, get some quick wins, right? This is going to help you kind of avoid challenges and avoid overwhelming issues. If you can find some quick wins, some low-hanging fruit, you engage people who need help or willing to accept help, you get advocacy from those people, let the advocates start telling the story to the rest of the business, and tie that in with your communication and self-marketing.
Mm-hmm.
That just kind of resets expectations of people, and they say, oh, well, I can see you helped HR here. Maybe you can help me in marketing, right? And those kind of things.
And I just want to jump in just before Kelly, you throw some more questions to Joe and Jen. I think it was really important, that moment when you're informing people on why you are there is one of the most critical moments for the long-term success of your group, because it's really easy to go and say, I'm there to help the business save money. And you do that, and then one of the biggest, if not the biggest challenge that we all have in procurement is this perception that we only exist to save money. And so if you perpetuate that in those early conversations, then you're going to be siloed as to somebody that, I'll use them when I need help in saving money, but I don't need them any other way. So kind of what the elevator pitch is so important to setting up on the right note.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say, don't say that. Say, I'm here to help you solve problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
It broadens it out.
Well, to your point about solving problems, Joe, so we've talked about sort of the diagnosis phase. If we try to move over into the other side of that, where procurement is going to help figure out the right solution and then hopefully play an active role in carrying that out, we're under all these pressures. The business is coming to us and they're feeling worried, they're feeling concerned, they're trying to jump ahead to the end of the process. Actually, who was coming to mind as we were all just talking about this was actually George Costanza. Hopefully there's some Seinfeld people here. I was thinking about the episode where they're playing basketball and he's desperate for the ball. Give me the ball, give me the ball. But the second he gets it, he chucks it. And they finally say to him, no, you're a chucker. You can't be the guy we hand the ball to. How can procurement avoid becoming so reactive that there's all this buildup as we try to position ourselves as part of the solution, but the first moment we get the opportunity to go hands-on, we instinctively become reactive and we chuck the ball. How can we be more proactive so that we don't get sort of knocked back on our heels and find ourselves in a reactive place? I'm sorry, I'm talking to you, Joe. I'm in my mind thinking of asking you this question.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind. One, which I think we've spoken about before, is really trying to make sure you have a good intake process, right? That folks understand when to bring procurement in and why. So tied back, Phil, to that communication, that's important. And to make it really simple, right? Like don't bring us in when you have a contract ready to be signed. Bring us in when you're building out requirements, and we can help and give specific examples for what procurement can do to help in those areas. And then tying to that, showing them that value by bringing insights to the table when you get invited at that in those early stage kind of requirement sessions, which is, don't just say, okay, what do you need, and write it down and put it in an RFP, but engaging suppliers, right? That's what procurement is supposed to be doing, engaging suppliers, asking them for solutions. Going back to COVID, where we saw the best success with things like what do we do? We're keeping our facilities open. What do we have to do from a compliance perspective and a safety perspective, right? Companies didn't have experts in those areas, but the suppliers did. And so the procurement folks that went and engaged suppliers and got answers for how do we set this up the right way to make sure we're checking all the boxes and keeping our employees safe. Think about the value that they were bringing to the facilities team or the HR team or whoever was responsible for those things when they got those insights from suppliers, and we could say, oh, all these other companies are doing this, and this is why we're going to do the same thing. And so having those examples is really important. And then the other piece is, we always have this idea, we want to be like respond to the timing that the stakeholders give us, right? We're at the last stage of this contract. We have to get it done by the next week. It's okay to question that a little bit, right? Not to push back super hard and say, no way, this is getting done, but to say, hey, let's talk about why this is so urgent right now. Can we maybe add, a month so I can do X, Y, and Z? And if I can do X, Y, and Z, then you're going to get this kind of value out of it. And showing those kinds of ideas to stakeholders of why changing the timeline or reducing some of the urgency or finding a workaround for it will really help them in the long run. Because, we see all the time, right? You get the RFP, it's 100 questions, it's due back tomorrow, and that's the perception a lot of suppliers have of procurement. And it's the wrong one. But I think a lot of procurement people just fear pushing back on their stakeholders. And so they put it on the suppliers, where it's okay to hold the suppliers accountable, but it's also okay to hold your stakeholders accountable to get the best result for the company.
Yeah. Now, Jennifer, we were talking actually before we came on today, sort of this challenge that I think applies even beyond problem solving, where we might sit down with the business and they'll say, okay, here's my very niche specific problem. Have you ever solved this exact, precise, identical problem before? And we may be saying, no one on earth has actually faced that exact specific problem before, but I've solved this problem and this problem and this problem and this problem. And I didn't know how to solve any of those either. So I'm a problem solving generalist. How can we keep the business's trust and make that case to them that, no, being honest, I've not done that very specific thing before. However, we have the frameworks and the experience and suppliers we can draw on. How do we balance those two things to sort of be honest with the business about what we've done, but to help them understand that having solved lots of different kinds of problems in the past is actually an asset if this exact situation hasn't been encountered?
Yeah, I think a few things come to mind. Number one, what we keep talking about is don't be afraid to challenge the stakeholder and push back a little bit, right? And say, no, you don't need to have that expertise. That's not the value I bring here in this situation. Here's what I can do, to your point, right? But it's also coming up with, I think, again, going back to creativity, right? How can we solve this together and remind them that they are the business owner in this specific category or space, right, with this particular contract, that I'm not going to come here and be the expert in that. I'll never be truly the expert. That's your job. I'm here to be procurement and navigate you through this process and do the heavy lifting from that standpoint. Ask the right questions, bring the right terms to the table. And it's funny when Joe had just mentioned that story too, like it came up I had a project last year where it came to us like, we have to close this contract in the next 30 days. We have a major problem with the current supplier. We need to change it over. And immediately I looked at the contract and I saw many red flags. And I said, you have to address this. And she was so thankful at the end that she did put it on hold. She spent the time to address some of those issues, because in the end, it worked out better for her. Now we had a contingency plan set up that in the event that the bad supplier, did just suddenly leave tomorrow, the new supplier could jump in quickly, but let us work through these issues first. And if you have a good supplier, they're going to do that, right? That is where we come to the table as being the problem solvers and knowing how to navigate the environment, because that stakeholder, they see red, right? I have a problem. I have to fix this right now. And that's all they can see. They're not seeing everything around that. That's the value we bring to the table, to say, the consultant in that situation, ask the right questions, think through things in a calm manner, and just offer that different perspective that the stakeholders just possibly not going to see because they're so invested in that solution.
Now, follow up on that. You talked about sort of being consultative in these kinds of situations. And we've talked about being entrepreneurial today, or sometimes people will use the word intrapreneurial, right? So you're inside the company, but you're functioning in a consultative manner. How much of a difference do you think it makes when the moment comes that procurement has to push back on the business to actually be someone that worked for the same company versus being someone who has come in from the outside that can provide a little bit of objectivity, maybe carefully and delicately dig in a little bit? How much does it change that dynamic when it comes to saying, not no, but hold on, before we jump, let's just take a minute and think? Do you find that it makes a big difference?
I don't think it, I mean, I don't really think it does. I think it'll also depend on if you're the outside party, when are you coming in, right? So if you have an established relationship with the company, it's probably going to be a little bit easier than if it's the first time you're jumping in. There's going to be resistance no matter what, right? But I think it's still the same kind of approach of, thinking through the long-term benefits, bringing the same components in. To your point, I do find that internally there might be a slightly different perception because, hey, we still have to work together tomorrow. So if I'm going to challenge this person, I still have to see them at the water cooler tomorrow. And that might be kind of that reaction that we talked about earlier in terms of the fear, because as a consultant coming in, I don't have to see you tomorrow. I can walk away, right? So there's not as much of that long-term kind of feeling that I have to show up tomorrow and see you. But I would think that actually makes you more invested because, hey, I'm your partner for good, right? I'll be here tomorrow, no matter where this goes. I'll still be here to help you. If we have to move quickly through this particular problem, then next time let's think about it this way. I think it actually gives you more of an advantage.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would just add, though, that sometimes some of the bigger and politically sensitive problems require the third party because there's either internal credibility gap that no matter, you hire people who are experienced and can solve problems and know how to do things, but then the internal politics tied to it could sometimes have a negative impact on those people and their expertise. So bringing the third party, I hate to say it, sometimes we're consultants, right? We're brought in to help solve problems. Sometimes the customer already knows what problem they need to solve and how to do it. They just need to hear a different voice telling it to them. And so it can be, depending on the nature of the problem, something that's necessary to get the job done. So if you feel stuck, that might be an avenue you want to take.
Let's talk then about, so you've diagnosed the problem, you've figured out a solution, but a little bit down the road, determining how much of a success the chosen approach was. Joe, as we start to think about, the success of the overall problem-solving process is likely to be measured in terms of the business impact associated with the solution that the team picked together. How early in the process do the metrics or KPIs that will determine the success of the effort and therefore the problem-solving journey have to be set? Should that be part of an early conversation? Is it something that becomes more apparent as the solution itself takes shape? How would you start to advise people about thinking around measuring overall success?
Start on day one. Yeah, start at project initiation. We do it every time we start a new project. Is what is the definition of success? What are the KPIs we're looking for here? Stakeholders aren't always going to have an answer that early on, right? Because it's some of these projects, they're conceptual in nature and they get more refined as they go on. But getting that thought process started is super important because at the end of the day, you want to be able to measure it. You want to be able to hold the suppliers accountable. You also want to set up some processes and governance so that those things are measured, right? Sometimes it's in procurement's court. Sometimes it's in a different, third-party supplier relationship manager role. Sometimes it's in the stakeholders' role to measure on an ongoing basis. But whatever it is, you need to set that up as part of the project and refine as the project goes, right? So folks might not have an answer for day one, or they might have an answer for day one that changes over time as you really go from conceptual to reality. But if you don't do it, it's almost like, right? you're kind of riding a bike with no wheels. You don't really know where you're headed, and you don't have a good way to point to something and call it a success or a failure if you don't have that stuff and if you don't establish it very early on in the project.
Well, and Jen, I almost wonder if that's a really good way to help the business understand that maybe what they're asking for is not actually what they want. I mean, certainly everyone that's been in procurement for more than 24 hours has had a stakeholder come to them and say, nope, this is the supplier. I've done my homework. I know this is the right decision. This is the supplier. So whether it's picking a supplier or solving some other type of problem, might putting potential metrics or measures in front of them help them realize, whoa, that's not what I expected to see at all. Could it almost be a productive way of bringing a disconnect to the surface?
Yeah, I think so. And if nothing else, it can even be a measure of confirming that it's the right choice. So we can approach it different ways. We don't always want to feel like we're trying to challenge them, right? We might just trying to be an avenue for additionally confirming that they've made the right choice by, again, asking the right questions, but defining success in a measurable way. And that can be quantitative as well as qualitative, kind of making sure that you're thinking through all aspects. But it could just be a matter of, yes, we've thought about all these things and it meets the demand, because it's important to remember, as a partner, you're trying to mitigate risk down the line. So even coming back and saying, hey, as procurement, we work with finance a lot. We know what questions they're going to ask you. We know what legal is going to ask you. Have you thought about these things and can you answer them? Yes. Great. Then we're going to move right through this process and you're not going to have a problem. Let me help you, navigate through the rest of this, right? It might be, we've talked about this before, picking your battles, right? And just helping shepherd them through this time for that quick, the quick win could be just, hey, just tweak these couple of things because I know you have a tight timeline, but hey, next time, let me help you a little bit sooner. And not being a point of resistance sometimes can be that quick win to get them calling you next time to say, hey, I know you helped me a little bit last time. Why don't you come a little bit sooner and help me earlier? It's all about getting to know your stakeholders and knowing what approach to take with them, because it might even be different with different stakeholders based on their prior experience with procurement or lack thereof. It's all about navigating relationships, I think, internally.
Well, Phil, as we start to come to the end of our time, I actually want to transition back to you with a question. We have focused so much on urgency and fixing problems and coming up with solutions. But one of the things that we talk about on our team all the time is procurement's role in helping other people imagine the art of the possible. Mm-hmm. In these moments when people are panicking and whether the urgency is real or not, it feels real. How can we challenge ourselves and therefore challenge the business to see beyond the immediate problem that we're faced with and think longer term or bigger picture so that we're not losing sight of what the real longer term vision is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So we've done some coaching and training on crisis management just as part of one of our training programs. And so that kind of comes to my mind when I think about it's really in how you respond in the moment. As we're responding to a stakeholder who has, an urgent need, or, something in the supply chain is broken and everyone's panicking because a part isn't going to get to go wherever it needs to be. Whatever it is, that moment of panic that leads people, or that moment of I need to fix something quickly that leads people to you. It's about taking a breath, frankly, and just, you can actually kind of have a checklist of what to do when a crisis occurs or when a perceived crisis occurs. And you're kind of walking through that around, okay, understanding the situation, understanding what the problem is, understanding what some of the potential, kind of playing out some scenario planning. And starting to communicate that back to the stakeholder to think about the bigger picture, other than just this, I need this one thing now. Now, that may not lead to you having the ability to make different decisions, but it makes sure that you're not just doing something that's really reactive and responsive because of, the micro problem that might be occurring, that you just take it. And maybe that problem is so big that you need to respond in that way and you just need to focus on doing that. But it's just about taking a breath, really, and not immediately responding to, the challenge or the panic of the day. And playing out a series of questions so that people come to you and look at you, because being a problem solver, if we're seen as being problem solvers within procurement, so many folks in the business are going to see us differently and the way that they interact and work with us. So if we can be seen as just helping them think through a problem, think through the solutions, and actually be a bit more strategic about how you solve them, as opposed to being really reactive and just kind of doing the first thing that comes to mind. I think that that's a superpower for procurement that we can certainly play into. All right. Well, with all that being said, I know we're coming up on time. So, Kelly, I want to thank you as always for joining me on AOP Live. But Joe and Jen, it's always a pleasure. I always know that our conversations can probably go on for longer than we have the time to do it. So I'm sure we'll be doing this again soon. But thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having us, and love the new branding, by the way.
Thank you very much. The gold curtains of the hotel room were not part of the new branding.
Hey, gotta be agile, right?
And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We'll be back, of course, with a number of other AOP Lives coming up. You can always view those just by going to artofprocurement.com/calendar. So one last time, thank you very much, everybody. Take care.
Bye.